3A, amounts and directions. So today we're going to start talking about signed numbers. So signed numbers have an amount and a direction. So basically when we're talking about signed numbers, you're talking about when you have negative versus positive, such as -5 and +5. So 5 is the amount, and this negative or positive is the sign, and we say that tells the direction of what's happening. So when we have a negative in front, such as this -5, that means we're taking away something, such as with money, that would be a debit. Or it means that something's going downward, or going to your left. Okay, so we would consider those to be negatives. If I toss a ball into the air when it's going up, we would consider that to be positive. But when it starts coming down, we would consider that to be negative. So positives and negatives. So positives would be reporting credits when you're dealing with money. You're gaining, right? Or it's going upward, or it's right facing. Now, we do have a general statement. If you remember with radicals, I said that if you have a radical sign and there's no index, then we assume that to be a square root. Same thing with signed numbers. If you have a number without a sign, we assume it to be positive. So +5 or +5 is the same as 5. So we consider those to be the same. So we just don't, lots of the time, we don't bother putting in the sign for a positive number. Obviously, for a negative number, we have to do that. Sometimes negative numbers get written with parentheses around them. So parentheses around a -5 is equal to -5. And the reason we do that is because it can sometimes be easy to confuse a minus sign with a negative sign. So that's why we put this around it. It also allows us to do different operations and such that we will talk about a little later. Now, when you're dealing with positive and negative numbers, you're now dealing with integers. Integers are positive and negative whole numbers. So essentially, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So basically, starting at -infinity, going up to 0, through the negatives to 0, and then counting up again. So remember, whole numbers are your natural numbers being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Your counting numbers. Whole numbers adds in that. So let's look at this a little bit. So these are our integers. Well, we also can go beyond that and get into real numbers. Real numbers are basically positive and negative decimals. So real numbers are positive and negative decimals. And of course, 0 is part of that. So we could kind of group these and show a relationship between this. If you remember, we talked about natural numbers, we've talked about whole numbers, we've talked about integers, we've talked about decimals, or now we're going to say real numbers because they can be plus or minus. So let's show a relation between these. So if I were trying to relate these, my smallest grouping would be natural numbers. Natural numbers, you remember that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, our counting numbers. Well, if we add a 0 into that, then we get the whole numbers. Whole numbers are the natural numbers with the addition of 0. If we add negatives to that, then we get integers. Which are your positive and negative whole numbers. And then if we go beyond that and say, well, I don't want to just deal with integers, I want to deal with decimals, then we get to real numbers. Which are your positive and negative decimals. So going beyond integers, but all the way to real numbers. So that's our grouping there. So let's see if we can classify some numbers. So if I have the number -7, which of these number systems is that part of? Well, -7, we can start from the inside. Is it a natural number? The natural number are your counting numbers and they don't have signs. So nope, it's not natural. Is it a whole number? Well, it's got a negative and whole numbers are not negative. So it's not that. Integer, yep, it is an integer. And there goes that marker. So we'll say it is an integer. And then it is also a real number because integers are part of the real numbers. So real number. So there we go. So we classified -7. What about 8.2? 8.2. Well, let's see. Is it a natural number? No, it's not a counting number. Is it a whole number? No, it's not a whole number because it's not 0 or a counting number. Is it an integer? Nope, it's got a decimal to it. Is it a real number? Yes, it is. So that is a real number. So a real number. What about 0? You can convince that to work a little bit. So we have 0. Well, is 0 a natural number? Natural numbers are your counting numbers. 1, 2, 3. Nope, it's not a natural number. Is it a whole number? Yes, it's a whole number. So it is a whole number. And remember, once you get out to a certain circle, remember these are inside of each other. So if it's a whole number, it must be then it must be an integer, and it must be a real number. So if you're part of one of the inner rings, you're also part of the outer rings. But if you're part of the outer ring, you're not necessarily part of the inner ring. Okay? Last thing I want to touch with this, introducing these amounts and directions, is absolute value. Absolute value looks at the amount and ignores the direction. And if we're trying to take the absolute value of something, we do a vertical line with whatever we're taking the absolute value of, and another vertical line. So those two lines tell us we're taking the absolute value of whatever A happens to be. Absolute value takes I call it the magnitude. It's how big is the number, and it just ignores the sign. So you can think of it as just chopping the sign off of it. Any number you have, if you take the absolute value of it, it's going to stay the same, just get rid of the sign. So if I take the absolute value of -6, that's going to be 6. We just got rid of the negative sign. Boom, gone. If I say the absolute value of 7, that's going to be 7, because if we get rid of the sign, we still just have 7. The absolute value of negative 8.72319, just drop the sign, 8.72319. So absolute value always just gets rid of the negative sign. That's all it does. Or it gets rid of the sign period. So it's always going to be an unsigned number by the time you get done with it. Now, let me just expand on this a little bit so we can get an idea of what happens if we take this a little further. Well, what if I have negative absolute value of negative absolute value of negative 6? Now we know that order of operation says grouping, right? And these absolute values are grouping, so I have negative 6. So I'm going to take the absolute value of negative 6, and that would be 6. So we have negative, negative 6. Right? Because that negative 6 just becomes a 6, and now I have negative. The absolute value of negative 6 is 6. So I have negative 6. So just like we did with parentheses or anything else, when you have something inside of this absolute value, that gets done first. It's still a part of our grouping. We also might see something like this. Actually, I don't want to go into that. I was going to take you a step further, but I want to leave that alone. But we can see that it's going to just, we take the absolute value, then we take the absolute value, then we take the absolute value, and we work our way along. Okay? So that is amounts and directions.